How many times have I been here? I haven't gotten a watch. Anyway, so I was absolutely sure what we were going to talk about tonight. Obviously, the looming presidential election, the trial of a former president, the whole question about whether democracy is at risk. I was absolutely sure that would be the main topics until about 24 hours ago. But what happened in the Middle East clearly has political consequences, which just adds to the complexity of trying to do an analysis of what may be the most singular, unusual, consequential presidential campaign ever. People say that every 4 years, and often it isn't true. It's the most important presidential election of the people running, but not necessarily for us. This time is different. And so it makes it even more appropriate that we discuss these issues tonight for the 6th time, I'm told, making FDR look like a piker, with Maggie Haberman of the New York Times and Alex Burns of Politico. The two of them were a team at Politico. They went to the New York Times together. Alex Burns is now back at Politico, holding the august title of Head of News. Maggie Haberman, I don't really think I have to describe too much her activities in the last 6 years. You see her in the pages or on your pixels on the New York Times, as well as on CNN. I don't think either of them, and I am not, reckless enough to try to do predictions, because predictions, that's a fool's game. But an analysis of trying to put what's going on into some perspective, that can be done if you've got the right people. We got the right people. Please say hello again to Maggie Haberman and Alex Burns. Middle. Hello.
Hi there.
Not much going on this year, huh? This is not a conversation about diplomacy or international affairs, but it's obvious that the implications of what's gone on in Gaza are huge for the political process. So I guess the question is, beyond what happened 24 hours ago, and beyond what may or may not happen in the days ahead, what's your sense of how the two campaigns have dealt with the post-October 7th reality?
I'm happy to take this first. First of all, thank you all for being with us again. Alex and I love doing this event with Jeff. This is, what is this, our 6th time? Sixth time. Look, I think that we have seen President Biden was very steadfast in support of Israel. I think that he is a longtime believer in the state of Israel. The criticism that he has had from not just his political left, but frankly more from his center left as well, is that he has been too slow to talk about the brutality of the Israeli war in Gaza. And we have seen some shifts in that, but they've been late. We have obviously seen there has been a domestic political cost to him in places like Michigan. And in Trump's case, Trump was because Trump experiences everything in life in terms of how it directly impacts him or has impacted him. He was so angry at Bibi Netanyahu for congratulating Biden when he won that I'm not kidding. This is that he initially was very critical of Netanyahu, and that alarmed some of his harder right pro-Israel / Jewish supporters. He has since been a bit all over the map. He delivered comments in an interview with an Adelson-owned paper in the Mideast in which he sounded frankly a lot like Biden about how Netanyahu needs to wrap up the war pretty quickly. And then he's tried tacking away from that. But there's been nothing coherent or consistent from Trump about how he would handle this conflict.
Except to tell us that this would never have happened.
Right, well, and he says that. He says that a lot. I mean, he says that about every global development that has happened, and that fits more broadly into this strong versus weak frame that he is trying to articulate against President Biden.
But it strikes me, Alex, that this is a dilemma of exquisite, in the negative sense, difficulty for the president. I mean, the Jewish vote is traditionally about 75%, more or less, in a national election. And clearly there must be some supporters of Israel who feel that he's backing off, critical of Netanyahu, telling him, you're not going to have my support if you go after Iran. Apart from the peeling off of those younger voters who seem to be, if the polls are right, overwhelmingly, if not shockingly, on the Palestinian side. You have any sense of how they plan to square this circle?
I'm not sure that they have a sense of how they plan to square the circle. And Jeff, I think what's so striking from a political standpoint is how invisible the president is most of the time in talking about this. You're right, of course, that he's in a political bind, and I think that you're right to identify young voters as broadly the biggest problem for him. Yes, Muslim Americans, yes, Arab Americans represent political challenges, but when people focus on those communities, I think it actually understates the political pain that the president may well experience because of this war. When you see young people who are viewing the campaign in Gaza as genocide and blaming Joe Biden for it, genocide is not one of those things that it's not a claim you can easily take back, right? And if you're a voter who sees this event in those terms, you're probably not just going to forget that, get over it by November just through the passage of time. I don't think it's clear that the administration has a particularly developed theory of how to reach those people. I think they have missed some really significant opportunities, perhaps most importantly a couple weeks ago when Senator Schumer here gave that extraordinary speech on the Senate floor saying that Israel ought to hold new elections and have a different government there. That, I think people here probably recognize the significance of that moment. I'm not sure that the country as a whole or the world may have processed what an earthquake that was in the world of pro-Israel politics.
That one hit me perhaps as strongly as any statement by any American official. The idea that the majority leader of the U.S. Senate, himself Jewish, which may make a difference, has called for new elections in another country. I'm trying to think of a parallel. I don't know.
Right, and the fact that after that, what you heard from the White House and what you heard from the president was, Senator Schumer gave a good speech. Okay, I think Benjamin Netanyahu knows what that means. I think Chuck Schumer knows what that means. I don't think that kids on the campus of the University of Michigan know what that means, right? I don't know that voters in, the suburbs of, insert city here know, the president's saying that's a good speech. He's not really elaborating further. It's because he can't go further than that for diplomatic reasons, because Chuck Schumer went a little bit further than anyone's ever gone before. Like, they just leave voters to do a lot of work for themselves, and I'm not sure that this is a situation where the electorate's likely to reward that.
Which brings me to a notion that may sound incredibly flip or even cynical, but what the hell. That looking at what happened just yesterday, I'm concluding that two of the luckiest people in the world are Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump. Netanyahu, because it extends the running room he may have to take action that might otherwise divide Israel, and Trump, because it further puts the squeeze on Joe Biden politically. Is that over the top?
It's certainly not over the top, with the caveat that it's obviously uncomfortable to talk about anybody's luck in these circumstances. But politically, yes. It's certainly, I think, good for Benjamin Netanyahu. There's no question about that. And as long as there is a sense of Israel under threat, his durability appears intact. I'm less certain on what it means for Trump, other than broadly, as we discussed, the strong versus weak frame. And Alex's point, I think, can't be emphasized enough, certainly in the case of what we're talking about with the war. But I think you can make this point that Biden's been pretty sporadic on a number of issues, not the least of which is talking about Trump as an existential threat to democracy, which people don't hear that way if you give a speech about it every few months and don't talk about it that often. But I do sort of think that I don't really know who the persuadable voters are in this election, Jeff. I mean, who are the people, and I might be jumping ahead here, but it relates to your...
No, we're going to get, but it's
Sure, but it
very much
relates to this. I mean, so, you know, is it great for Trump? I don't know. I mean, I feel like everything over the last 9 years has been interpreted through some lens of, is this good or bad for Donald Trump? And I don't, you know, Donald Trump goes on trial tomorrow in Lower Manhattan, so he's clearly got his mind on other things. I don't know how many voters are going to see what happened over the weekend as some nuanced take on where they might be. I think there's a lot of younger voters who don't like either of these candidates. I talk to younger voters who tell me they don't see a difference between these two candidates, and that they want to vote for, I'm not kidding, and they want to vote for a third party candidate, an independent candidate. So.
But you have anticipated with great skill where I want to go next, because I want to turn back to the broader political picture. You are going to be spending tomorrow morning at
100 Center Street.
I'm sorry, I should have known that address, but I didn't.
God, Jeff.
And in a column in a piece of the New York Times, of which you are a co-writer, you have suggested that Trump is looking at this trial, and maybe his entire legal troubles, as a chance for a win. What do you think he and his campaign mean by winning?
It's a great question. So, a couple of things. This is, at the moment, likely to be the only trial he faces of the 4 indictments that he has in various states. The trial that had seemed likeliest previously was going to be the federal trial stemming from his efforts to subvert the 2020 election results. And I will be very surprised if that happens before the election. It's not impossible, but I will be surprised. So in this case, his lawyers and aides are not optimistic about the idea of an outright acquittal. It's going to be a fascinating jury selection. It's only Manhattanites. I will be very interested which Manhattanite doesn't have an opinion of Donald Trump and doesn't know about this case or some aspect of it. But what they are hoping for is potentially a hung jury, which is not impossible, it just takes one. And they have targeted demographics around that they're looking at for that. But in terms of the court of public opinion, which is where he's been fighting all of this since he was indicted first by Manhattan on March 30th of 2023, they are hoping to suggest that, you know, this is an unfair prosecution, that it's a flimsy case, that you know, the Southern District of New York, the federal prosecutors declined to prosecute on this when he left office. I mean, that's all true. At least the lack of prosecution is. And it is true that his supporters are going to rally to his side and have been. This indictment was galvanizing within the Republican Party for him at a time when the primary was just beginning. All of his rivals were forced to criticize this indictment. I will just asterisk this. So everything we wrote is true. But I will asterisk this with the fact that I think Donald Trump hates everything about this trial. He wants this case just to go away. He said as much on Truth Social this morning. This case should not be happening. It is personally uncomfortable for him. It is personally embarrassing for him. It is a bunch of details that he cannot stand. It is going to be a face-to-face confrontation, not the first one, the second one with Michael Cohen, his former lawyer and fixer. One of his longtime aides, Hope Hicks, is likely to testify. Stormy Daniels is likely to testify. So, yes, I mean, winning is being defined down a bit, but at the end of the day, he is looking toward November, and so to the extent they can use this for that, that's a win.
And we can broaden this out to the notion that, at least in my view, for 9 years, those who do not like Donald Trump have seen his demise more often than Freddy Krueger has been, or Jason has been put into the grave in one of those movies. I mean, there was, you know, the Access, he insulted John McCain, he insulted Gold Star Mothers, the Access Hollywood tape when the head of the RNC said maybe he should leave the ticket. There was a Mueller investigation. There was the COVID stuff. There was January 6th. And 4 indictments, not to mention the fact that a jury has found him guilty of sexual abuse.
A civil jury, though.
Who was that? Nancy Mason. Well, it was only a civil jury.
I'm just
I understand
making the
it was
point
not a
that it's
criminal
civil jury.
case. It was, you know, is dimly remembered from the law school days. It was a civil case, but a jury said, yeah, you sexually abused this woman and you defamed her. And yet, it's almost like everything that other people think of as fatal just gives him more power.
Well, I'm going to disagree with you there, Jeff. There's obviously a lot of truth to that view of the last 9 years of Trump. But
I'm prepared to be corrected.
Where I would counter is Donald Trump and the party he leads have lost or underperformed in every election other than one since Trump took over the party. So I think there are a lot of people to the left of center. Maggie and I have talked about this like hundreds of times. But there are plenty of people to the left of center who clearly imagine this moment where, you know, the right hectoring reporter or the right daring prosecutor confronts him on camera, and there's this like, you got me, I'm a fraud, it's all over, right? And he'll never be seen in this town again. And like, that's not going to happen because it's Donald Trump, right? It didn't happen after he declared bankruptcy. It didn't happen after the first divorce or the second divorce, or, right? But like politically, he is like the definition of damaged goods, right? And if he were running against the Joe Biden of 10 years ago, I don't think this would be a particularly close race. Or if he were running against the Joe Biden of today and inflation were half what it is, right? We happen to be following an election with two very compromised candidates, compromised for very, very different reasons and to different degrees. Having said all of that, what I think is true is, you know, there's not going to be a Perry Mason moment where it's suddenly all over curtains for Donald Trump.
It's like people have been waiting. I'm really dating myself even more. But, you know, Perry Mason for years always ended with a courtroom confession. Yeah. Perry Mason would say, aha, and the guy would collapse and say, yes, I did it. You're right. I'm awful. And it's as though members of the press and Trump's political opponents have just been waiting for the absolute smoking gun to say, yeah, Trump.
I don't know any member of the press is waiting for that anymore.
I think in some ways we've overcorrected in the other direction,
I completely
right?
agree with you.
You know,
So they've given up. They've not.
No, Alex should finish that thought because
well, just the notion that like, whatever. I was having this debate with colleagues pretty recently that. Yes, it's a hush money trial. It's not election subversion. No, he probably wouldn't do jail time. I do think that convicted criminal Donald Trump has a different resonance than civilly liable Donald Trump.
Which was the point I was making when I was pointing out that was a civil jury. It is a different thing. He has not been here before. And one of Donald Trump's skills is at convincing the collective everyone of a version of the litany that you went through, which is he's gone through all of this has happened before, it's all slid off of him. These things were all not the same. I will say to you, this was a conversation I was having with someone today about Access Hollywood. There's a lot of women who realized that was probably not going to do him in when that tape happened, that there were a lot of men who were not going to say, oh man, that's terrible, and walk away.
Well, in fact, there were Trump-supporting women back there. Well, all these guys do it.
And there were Trump voters at, you know, a Paul Ryan event who booed him when he criticized Trump. Like, it was pretty clear that was not necessarily going to be the fatal blow it seemed, at least right away. And so I do think this is different. I also think that how he reacts to this is going to be different, to the point that I was making about how he really hates this trial. I don't know how he's going to act during it. He's going to be doing rallies in the middle. I don't know what he's going to say at these rallies, and I don't know how he is going to handle. You know, he had my colleague Jonathan Swan had reporting when he was at Axios after Trump was impeached, where Trump made a pretty candid admission on a call with House Republicans, where he was like, impeached is not something you want on your resume. You know, convicted criminal is not either. And so I don't know how he's going to react to that.
And to your point, for whatever reason, the polls, which I'm hoping we don't talk about too much, but because it's the crack cocaine of our business, is the New York Times now is saying that it's going to be close, very close.
That I think is probably true. I mean, not to be predictive.
I keep thinking of because I'm a contrarian, you know, what are the circumstances under which it would not be close?
I'm looking to you.
Well, for instance, again, this may seem too flip, but if one of the two candidates has a public display of the consequences of age and infirmity, that might actually have an impact.
Could. This requires so much fan fiction.
I won't take it down.
I do think, I don't think there's any scenario where it's not close in a sort of historical sense of somebody runs away with it, right? But I think we would probably all assume that it would be a 0 to 3 point race if the election were held in the next couple months. Scenario where it's more like a 5 to 7 point race, I think would involve one of the third party candidates really taking off.
Which, thank you. Guys are setting me up like
we're doing our
point
best
guard.
Exactly.
Yeah. We've seen what third party candidates can do and can't do. My asterisk on this is there was a myth about Ross Perot costing Clinton the election, which is not true. Costing Bush the election. The most detailed look, state by state, of that particular race showed no. But did Ralph Nader cost Al Gore Florida in the White House? Sure. So to that end, is there any notion that a third-party candidate can do anything but hurt Biden? There are people who say, well, Robert Kennedy Jr. is getting Trump kind of supporters. In your view, is there any scenario that doesn't hurt Biden if there's a visible third-party candidate?
I don't think, because of the number of third-party candidates, one or more of them will hurt Biden in some way, right? Like Cornel West just alone, if he were to get 10,000 votes in the wrong state for Biden, that could be curtains, right? I do think the Robert Kennedy phenomenon is really unformed, and I'm not quite sure where that bouncing ball is going to go, right?
It's hard to read.
If you look at the places where he's on the ballot so far, some of them are swing states, some of them are places like Utah and Idaho, right? Yeah. He has a conspiratorial, anti-government worldview that appeals to, it's the horseshoe theory of politics, right? There's people on the far left, there are people on the far right who you could see finding him attractive for some of the same reasons they find Donald Trump attractive. And it's not necessarily ideological, it's more just like tonal and vibes, right?
No, I agree with that. I also agree that Cornel West hurts one person. Jill Stein is, there's 3 third-party candidates that we know of right now. I don't think there's going to be a libertarian line candidate. I think Jill Stein is less poised to pull from Biden than she did against, say, Hillary Clinton in 2016, because I think so many Democrats had buyer's remorse about having voted for her, thinking that she was a safe off-ramp if they didn't like Hillary Clinton. I do find the Bobby Kennedy question harder to answer because he's not pulling evenly from both candidates, but he is pulling from both candidates, and it's different in each state, and the reasons why is different in each state. And also, there's sort of a Jonathan Swan and Shane Goldmacher and I wrote about the efforts by the Trump team to promote Bobby Kennedy. And in 2016, when Alex and I covered this race together, the Trump campaign was pretty open about trying to bolster Jill Stein. And then we found out 4 years later the extent of that, which was that there might have been other things, but Bernie Marcus, the Home Depot founder, who was a Trump supporter in 2016, also funded pro-Jill Stein efforts. So I don't really, and so much of this will be dark money that we won't be able to see. But I do expect you'll see things like that. But some of the messaging ideas that some of these folks have is like that they're going to suggest that Bobby Kennedy is to the left of Trump on abortion. Like Trump has taken so many different positions on abortion in the past week and a half that I don't know how effective that's going to be.
We also should just add, as a perhaps minor point, that Bobby Kennedy Jr.'s running mate is, as Daffy Duck would have put it, comfortably well off. And she's fully, there's no limit on what you can spend on your own campaign, so there may be that. I should also tell you that the head of news of Politico has his own notion of who should run third party, including David Chappelle and Huey Lewis-Dreyfus, because she's already been vice president.
And president, Jeff.
I think it's pretty, I think it's a pretty bold.
To be clear, I was not endorsing anybody in that.
No, you were just doing analysis.
Right. My point in that, in the column that Jeff is referring to is, I imagine some people are familiar with No Labels and their efforts to get somebody to run as a third-party candidate. And they had ballot access in a number of places. They had tons of money. They had a certain kind of blue chip consultant, and they had zero imagination about who to run as their candidate. Right? That if you look at successful independent campaigns in the U.S. and basically anywhere in the world, the winners are these sort of colorful, larger-than-life, unfiltered celebrity characters, right? Either actual, like literal celebrities or sort of celebrity-adjacent in some way, like media commentators and the like. And the notion that you are going to blow up the two-party system with the wild and unconventional ticket of Joe Manchin and Larry Hogan, right? Like, I don't think so.
I think that's a absolutely.
Is that fair? Yeah.
Absolutely valid. Absolutely valid notion. I'll devote 30 seconds to this. You want to weigh in at all about the Trump's running mate?
Not really. I mean, Trump does not. What I keep being told is that Trump is bored by all of his options. He was seriously flirting with the idea of putting Bobby Kennedy on his ticket. To be clear, I don't think he ever had that conversation with Bobby Kennedy, but he liked the way it sounded because he is a credentialist, and since then he has seemed incredibly bored, and I don't think we're going to have any idea until this trial is over.
Okay.
The only thing Maggie just hit on it about him being a credentialist, right? That for all I hear a lot of talk about surely he will choose a woman, surely he will choose a candidate who's not white, balance the ticket in this way, balance the ticket in that way. I don't know. It's pretty consistent that he chooses people who he thinks look the part.
Correct.
And that he likes a certain kind of pedigree, right? Either in terms of academics or in terms of business credentials or military service. And in a lot of Mike Pence was the most conventional choice he could have possibly made for vice president.
But a pretty smart one.
Yeah,
sure.
Of course.
But it was also.
Yeah,
it checked a bunch of personal boxes for Trump.
But the idea that he's going to go and choose, Judge Judy or whatever, like I don't think so.
Well,
I would actually not be a
okay.
bad choice.
In all modesty, since you nominated people for third party, I think I know what Trump should do. He should not pick a vice president. He should run it like The Apprentice.
Well, he is right now.
Every week he eliminates a different candidate, and then the night before the election, he lets the people vote, online or by phone. I think Biden disappears from the screen completely. And if you want to, to me, Maggie, this is, would you rather, if you're Trump, would you rather be known as the apprentice guy or a criminal defendant? So there you are.
I think the likeliest choice is J.D. Vance, but that is by no means certain. To answer your question.
Yeah, in fact, who did I say yesterday? I thought he was going to be the next presidential nominee of the Republican Party.
I think that's also very possible.
But let's go back to reality, and let's talk about the Democrats' greatest hope for a surge that may change the whole calculation. And that, of course, is abortion. It did leave me sort of amused that when the Arizona decision came down, Carrie Lake, who had previously thought what a great idea this 1864 law, suddenly turned into, I don't know who's the right example. Gloria Steinem is probably not right.
I don't think that's...
No, but she suddenly decided that this was a terrible law. From both of you, are the Republicans, as a general rule, nervous about the abortion issue, terrified about the abortion issue, think they know how to handle the abortion issue?
I'll start, but I'd be curious what Alex says. Every Republican I have talked to expresses enormous discomfort with where the party is talking about it right now. And I will say, the very first person to start saying that from the highest level, when the Dobbs draft decision was broken by Alex's colleagues at Politico back in 2022, was Donald Trump, who was saying to people privately, Donald Trump, who appointed 3 of the justices, that this is going to be bad for Republicans. And Donald Trump is personally not comfortable talking about abortion. He never has been. Go back and look at his comments in 2015 and 2016. His answer about leaving it to the states while not mentioning a federal ban until the next day has given nothing for down ballots candidates to grab onto.
Right.
And so, no, I don't think, Republicans know this is a problem for them, and they don't think it's a problem for them everywhere, but they think it is a problem for them in a lot of places.
I mean, that certainly reflects my perception of the situation, and I do think it's, there are those observations that you have, Jeff, as a political analyst, that you can deliver them at basically any time, and people are still not along. Like, oh, that's very, right. And like one of them is that Republicans had 50 years to figure out what they were going to do the day after Roe v. Wade fell. And here we are 2 years later, and they still have no clue. And that's an incredible failure of, I mean, even setting aside the policy dimension to it, it's a total failure of just political imagination, political preparation, and strategy. And I do think this is one of these issues, in the week after the Dobbs decision, you heard Republicans in Washington saying, this will not be great for us, but people are really focused on inflation. And honestly, if we have to, I'm being glib here, but this was sort of the zeitgeist at the time. Like, if we have to take it on the chin in a couple places on abortion, we'll get it over with in a midterm election and then move on. And my sense at the time was that that's not really how this issue works, that their side had spent 50 years trying to overturn Roe. Surely the other side would remember this longer than a midterm election. You've seen public opinion shift even within the Republican coalition on abortion rights, right? The notion of voters' comfort with abortion restrictions at any stage has decreased, and voters' discomfort, including conservative voters, with early term abortion restrictions has decreased in a pronounced way. And nothing that Donald Trump has said over the last week really gets to the heart of that. Now, Joe Biden, also not super comfortable talking about abortion,
Correct.
right? It's not a comparable political dilemma, but the word abortion was in the draft text of the State of the Union address. He did not say the word abortion, and my colleagues at Politico reported last week that the Biden campaign, is preparing this messaging blitz that's really about women who are affected by abortion restrictions talking about their own personal experience. That sounds like really good politics to me. I do think at some point the president himself is going to have to deliver the message in a confident and persistent, sustained way.
Which is the third issue on which we have said this about the president not delivering a message.
Right.
So let me, one of the things I appreciate about you guys is when I offer a notion that's wrong, you will let me know. So here's a notion, and feel free. It seems to me that for all of the liabilities that Biden has, which are obvious, that the issue that could take him down most probably is not age, and it's not immigration, it's inflation. Because even though the number doesn't look bad, we had 40 years after Paul Volcker of no inflation. Mm-hmm. And then because of the pandemic and the spending, we had a lot. So even though inflation is kind of leveled off, people are paying a lot more for a lot of stuff than they were. And this is not an issue that affects any particular segment of the country. It affects everybody. So you tell me, am I overstating the case? Is inflation not as serious a threat to Biden as I'm thinking it is?
I think it is a serious threat, but I think there's a related piece. Can I expand on that a bit? I think, and some of this is vibes, right? It's hard to quantify this in polling, but I think it is true. I think Alex would agree with this. The electorate is so incredibly sour, and inflation is certainly a piece of that. I think that voters might have an easier time dealing with the fact of inflation if the answer from the White House had not so consistently been, you're wrong, the economy's great. And it is true that the job numbers are good, and it is true that other indicators are good, but the housing indicators are not, and inflation is not. And so there is this absence of a sort of Bill Clinton style, I feel your pain, from Joe Biden, which is sort of shocking because he was the emotional ballast of the Obama White House, especially in that re-elect in 2012. But I do think there is this broader issue, which is The last time a lot of people remember feeling good in their lives was 2019. For whatever reason. It was either because they lost a loved one, they lost a job, they lost their home, they lost whatever. I can go to, their crime is up in their neighborhood. Their children's schooling was significantly impacted. And people are mad. And they are just sort of generally mad. And the last time they were happy, Donald Trump happened to be president. They were not happy because Donald Trump was president. They were happy because things cost less and it was before a pandemic. But I think there is this sort of emotional reaction, and I think that the current president pays a price. Do you think I'm wrong on any of this?
I don't think you're wrong on any of it. And I think that when you look around the world, you see it sort of across democratic systems, right? That there's a sour mood in most places, right? There's not, when you talk to people who are running for office or diplomats from other countries, you don't really hear anybody saying like, oh yeah, back home, the electorate is loving it, right? And that definitely presents a problem for Biden. I think it, to Maggie's point, I think the Biden of a dozen years ago probably would have been more intimately attuned to that feeling. Just being president is different from being vice president. Being 81 is different from being 69, right? But his own former chief of staff, Ron Klain, just last week was captured on audio by one of my colleagues saying, like, the president's out talking about bridges all the time, but people are upset about the price of groceries. That's true, right? And there is, Maggie and I first worked together during the 2012 campaign, first worked together closely during the 2012 campaign. You do sometimes get the sense that the Biden team and Biden himself is trying to run the economic message and the economic policy that Obama should have had, that they believe Obama should have had in 2009, 10, 11, right? We're going to spend a ton of government money. We're going to do some big projects. You're going to see them. You're going to be back to work, right? Well, people are pretty back to work, right? They just find themselves spending more on everything than they used to. And in fairness to the president, he doesn't have a ton of policy levers to work with,
that's
right? And that's, as you know, Jeff, like that's why inflation is such a killer.
If there are questions that you'd like to, if anybody has got questions and has filled out a card, it's time to bring the questions up. If nobody has questions, I do. When I listen to some of Trump's supporters, the Heritage Foundation, Steve Bannon, whoever, they're laying out a second Trump term in pretty maximist terms, sweeping out thousands of civil servants, going after the political opponents, using the Insurrection Act to quell civil disobedience, whatever. How seriously do we take the fact that all of the, quote, grown-ups that were going to restrain Trump in the first term, the Jim Mattises and the Rex Tillersons and the John Kellys, are not only not going to be with him, they are increasingly vocal about why they don't want him as president anymore. So what does that tell us about a potential second Trump term?
I would say a couple of things where I slightly disagree with you. I don't actually think these folks are that vocal. I don't hear Jim Mattis out there all the time making a consistent argument. I don't hear John Kelly out there all the time making a consistent argument. I think that everybody, I mean, one of the strangest aspects of the Donald Trump era is how episodic everyone is in how they handle him. And Alex has heard me do this bit 8,000 times, and you know what I'm about to say. And I don't know how many of you are Curb Your Enthusiasm fans, but I bet at least some of you. There's a famous episode where Larry David has a Holocaust survivor at the, I think it's at the Seder table, and then a star from the show Survivor, and they get in a fight, and someone knocks over a glass of wine, and Larry David's mother-in-law sits at the table without moving and says, "Somebody get a sponge." And Larry looks at her and says, "Why don't you get a sponge?" And in my opinion, everybody's method of dealing with Donald Trump has been somebody get a sponge. It is always somebody else's responsibility to deal with dispatching with Donald Trump in one way or another. So I don't actually see a ton of consistency there. In terms of the plans that you're describing, and Steve Bannon and the Heritage Foundation are actually not working in concert, and they actually have very different visions. There are things that these outside groups and these outside advisors are suggesting to Trump that Trump will be interested in. But basically, he will treat these plans, Project 2025 is a term have all probably heard by now, as pretty a la carte. But that said, Trump is talking about a very radical agenda. He is talking about mass deportations. He is talking about militarizing the border. He is talking about imposing much more expansive tariffs than he did previously. He is not only openly talking about not backing up NATO member states, although I would make the point he did this in 2016 too, but he had this comment about how, and I have no reason to believe this conversation actually happened, but it doesn't really matter, where he told a NATO nation leader that, if you don't pay your dues, I'll tell Russia to do whatever they want. So I'm missing the agency he cares about the most is the Justice Department. And he has openly said, I'm going to appoint a quote unquote real special prosecutor to go after the Bidens. And the implication there is that a real one will charge people, not just investigate. So, and he has talked about sending in the military into cities. He did that once in a speech last year, and not since, and it was almost like an aside. But, there is this thing, Alex and I have had this conversation before too, where Trump is sort of like Babe Ruth-like calling his political shot over and over about what he is going to do. And for whatever reason, everyone's like, no, he's not really going to do that. Well, I think it's a little late in the game to assume he's not going to do what he says he's going to do. And the usual incentives that would keep him from doing things before, people quitting, bad press coverage, elites not liking him, those don't really matter to him anymore. He's been indicted 4 times. I think his idea that he's going to get what he would call a quote-unquote good story from the New York Times, I think the moment's kind of gone on that. So, and he will, if he wins, he will not be running for re-election. And yes, I know then we're going to, okay. Under the current Constitution,
it's a reasonable assumption.
Okay, I understand, but I can only deal in absolutes that are in front of me right now. But that means he will be pretty unconstrained.
Yeah. I want to turn to some of these questions. Alex, knowing Trump's attitudes toward Muslims, will Arab Americans really refuse to vote for Biden? Or do you think Gaza has really had such an impact that they're willing to look past what Trump has said in the past?
I mean, you don't need to ask me, right? They're Arab American voters, Muslim Americans quoted in story after story, week after week, saying exactly that. Will some of them end up voting for Joe Biden? I don't know. But I would say I think there's a tendency to put a kind of binary moral calculus on voters who are actually not bound by that, right? And the notion that, like, he's such a racist, don't you know you have to stop him even if you believe the other guy is committing genocide. Well, they actually don't have to do that. They don't need to vote for Trump. They could vote for somebody else, or they could stay home, right? And that's the stay home vote is what Democrats are most worried about, right? They're not worried about mass defection of college students to Donald Trump. They're worried about mass defection of college students to the couch.
Wouldn't Trump have won in 2020 but for the pandemic? Now, there's no pandemic. I'm not sure what the conclusion of that is, but I happen to think that's right, that absent the pandemic, Trump probably would have won because people felt reasonably good about the country.
The economy was good.
Yeah.
I mean, that was what he was preparing to run on when the pandemic happened.
Yeah.
So.
You assent to that?
I don't know, right? I mean, we'll never know. But yeah, would he have been in better shape without the pandemic? Yes, definitely. Not least of all because without the pandemic, Democrats might have fought out their nomination all the way to the convention instead of just dropping the curtain on it in
South Carolina.
Right after South Carolina. But I mean, he's not the president anymore, right? And I do think an incumbent president, you have to have a really good reason to fire them most of the time, right? And much of the country sees Donald Trump as like a quasi-incumbent, but like he's still not the president, and it's a new election.
No, he's not, but one of the things about this campaign, one of the many things about this campaign that is so, it's so obvious that sometimes forget it, is he's not the president, but he's a former president who a great majority of his party thinks should still be president except for the Great Steal. That's unprecedented. I mean, unless you want to go back to Benjamin Harrison and Grover Cleveland. And I wonder to some extent whether or not Trump's credentials, just because he's been president, make him a really different candidate than he was 8 years ago.
Oh, I mean, I think there's no question about that, although I think you can cut that a couple of ways. He's basically not campaigning, and I think that really gets lost. He's posting on Truth Social, he's holding rallies maybe once a week. He's not doing anything that you would normally see in a campaign. There is this sort of sense of motion around these court cases, but he's not really doing much. He spent much more time in courtrooms in Iowa, in January, in the lead up to the Iowa caucuses than he did in events around Iowa. And so I don't know what it'll look like once this trial is over. I don't know what it'll look like during it. It's certainly true that just sort of the prestige of the presidency and the trappings of the presidency still stick to him. And my colleagues and I wrote a story about that, the way in which he has used that to act as if he is a president in exile. That certainly helps him. But I don't know, I think there's enough voters who are not Republicans. You know, we were talking about this backstage in a different context, but there was this this snippet this morning on ABC with George Stephanopoulos where he was talking to Chris Sununu, and he was basically going through the list of reasons through which Chris Sununu would still support Trump. You know, you'll still support him if he's convicted criminally. You'll still support him even though you say you think that he contributed to an insurrection. And it goes through the list, and Sununu says, yes, me and 51% of the country. Mm-hmm. It's not 51% of the country. Donald Trump's ceiling has been, I mean, this is what Alex was talking about before, has been pretty consistent this whole time. And so, yes, there are people, Trump is absolutely helped by that, but I don't know that he's helped enough.
And just to Maggie's point about the ceiling, we tend to talk about, I don't mean broadly the expansive we, I tend to talk about this election in terms of whether the trial will knock down Trump or whether this will help Trump or what have you. And in a lot of ways, like, his number does not move a lot, right? The trial could knock it down a little bit. Acquittal could bump it up a little bit. The bigger question is, can Biden pull his coalition back together? Because if he can, then it's probably game over, right? That if Biden can get the people who voted for not just him in 2020, but for his party in almost every election since then to do the same thing, then it gets really tough for Donald Trump. But right now, today, Biden's not doing that.
Right. Maggie, I promised we'd be out of here in time because you have a date tomorrow. But
that's okay.
But this question appealed to me. One of the listeners wanted to know, aren't you exhausted?
Is that why you're getting me out of here early?
Didn't you think? No. What the question means? Didn't you think around 2021? Okay, he's not the president anymore. I can go cover whatever you feel like covering. I mean.
No, because, short answer, in 2021, I was, among other things, I was working on a book that came out in 2022 about Trump. So I wasn't moving off to something else, number one. But number two, there were, this period where I thought I was going to have to work on this book was going to start right after Election Day in 2020. Well, nope, that didn't happen because there was no real transition. Right. And then after that, there was an impeachment trial. And then after that, a bunch of investigations started, and that summer it became clear that Trump was telling people, encouraging people to echo this idea that he was going to get reinstated, and that was obviously not going to happen, but the fact that he was still fixated on this sort of backwards-looking effort, and by then he had frozen congressional leaders for the most part. I mean, Mitch McConnell was where he was, but Kevin McCarthy, the Republican leader at the time, within 2 weeks of January 6th, goes down to Mar-a-Lago to try to smooth things over with Trump, to try to, ease his own way toward the majority. Rick Scott, who was leading the senatorial committee on the Republican side, went down to give Trump some newly created award by the committee in April of that year. And so, no, I mean,
yeah. Okay.
The Trump story doesn't end. It is he is the most regenerative. No, but I'm actually going somewhere with this.
Okay.
He is the most regenerative figure we have seen in political life. And to Alex's point, he wasn't done after the bankruptcies or the divorces or whatever. I think people are missing another critical what if, just since we've asked a bunch of what ifs tonight. And the one that I think about a lot is what happens between November 6th of 2024 and January 6th of 2025 if Donald Trump loses. Now, I also wonder what happens if Joe Biden wins. It's a little different because Joe Biden's already in the White House. But I expect you will see a lot of Republican legal challenges, and you will have a lot of, I think it's going to be a very complicated period. And then, if Donald Trump loses, why does anyone think he's not going to say he's running again?
Precisely.
And I don't, now, to be clear, I think the chances he actually does run are not high, but it will still freeze the party for another 2 years. So,
Which it leads to the question, then we will wrap. I'm going to let it.
please.
Is the Republican Party for the foreseeable future, whatever that means, a MAGA party? That is, whether Trump loses and somebody else steps up, is this party locked into the worldview that Donald Trump has presented over the last 8 years?
I think it's locked into Donald Trump.
I agree with that.
I think the worldview is kind of whatever he says it is. Now, there are some consistencies to that worldview that I expect to outlast him, and you see it across the sort of Western democratic world, concern about borders, anger about China, anger at sort of cultural elites in big cities. That's a near universal story in right-wing and nationalist politics at this point. But beyond that, Jeff, the details get pretty hazy, right? And if Donald Trump were to decide tomorrow that he's going to go off and play golf, actually, and just leave all this behind, like, what does the Republican Party believe about national security at this point? What does the Republican Party believe about trade or technology regulation or just or abortion, right? Like, I really don't know. I have some decent guesses, but I think they're going to have a massive fight over who they really are once they don't have Donald Trump to answer that question for them. And that could be tomorrow, or it could be 20 years from now.
And it was a fight that we thought we were going to be seeing in January of 2017,
Right.
and that didn't happen.
Well, I'm always reminded of Godfather 3 when these two show up, because they must be thinking at some point, every time we think we're out, he drags me back in.
We like doing this.
But I can't help it, because I think they are two of the most interesting and entertaining and provocative people that I could figure out. So don't be surprised in a year from now if I limp back from California and these two are right here where they belong. Thank you guys so much.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you. Are you okay?